I'm just mindful of speaking into the sacred space that's been created here, so I just want to hold that for a minute. But I also thought I might say a little bit more about myself and what it is that I think I have to offer, and hope that you'll support me in that as well. And I also have the sense that some of the themes that will speak to will get developed and transformed and built out through the day as well. So I do have an artistic background. I have a Master of Fine Arts and have painted for many years and have works in major collections. But many years ago, I decided that the production of art was not about creating commodities for the world. That in fact, it was more about a path of initiation rather than a path of production. And stepped out of that world and into the world of not-for-profits. Those of you who know the world of not-for-profits know very well that the relationship to money, the relationship to the world is an interesting challenge, a socially creative challenge, let's put it that way. And as I stepped into serving as the administrator at San Francisco Waldorf School, helping to build that organization, that school up, I kept finding, as I was also invited to other organizations, because people were wondering, so what, how do we go about this? I made one observation which has come back as kind of a core piece of work throughout my work in the recent years, and that is that the most impassioned, visionary people, inspiring leaders, somehow or other, when they sit down to the table to talk about money, it's the same people there, but a different set of personalities show up. Anybody ever had that experience? So I also made a second observation, which is that those very organizations, because, again, this is my theory, because they had so much unaddressed stuff around money, creating a negative field that was actually resisting the very resources that they thought they needed. So that led to the thought, if we could start transforming the money, maybe we could start opening up the pathways of support and nourishment and effective work in the world that was waiting to happen, so that those visions could actually land in the world. So that's a great thought until I got to that moment inwardly that said, wow, that's a great thought. Let's start transforming everybody's relationship to money. Oops, have I done that work myself, right? And the answer was no, and I really took up that work that led in many ways to the first book called The Genius of Money, which was a bit about my own inner journey with money, so that I could actually sit with people and say, yep, it's not an easy path to take, and it's fraught with challenges, but it's critically important work to do, partly because, does anybody in the room live without money? Like zero money? Anybody? Well, no, we all live in it. It's part of the world that we are in, and yet it moves to us and through us without a lot of consciousness to it. So that's what gave birth, if I can say, to the work around money in organizations, in people's lives, and the kind of personal transformation that entails. And then I was asked to come here to speak about intuition, money, and service. And I thought, this is really interesting. What do those really have to do with one another? So we've been co-hosting with Intuition and Service and LifeBridge Foundation a conversation called Money and Intuition. That's hard enough to put together, right? So what does money have to do with intuition? Add service to that as another dimension, and we end up with a whole bundle of illogic. And my hope actually this afternoon is to create a framework that may or may not be logical, but hopefully makes some sense, and that they're actually linked as part of a whole. For me, that is the critical piece, that each of them has a important function in the world, a different function, but they're all related to each other. But it may require a little shift in consciousness for us to see that way. In the same time that we need to shift our consciousness around money, you can't shift your consciousness around money without shifting your consciousness around every other aspect of the whole system that we're in, because money is part of that system. So it doesn't matter which doorway you enter. So I'd like to invite you on a little bit of a journey with me into that transformational process. And that will include, so I didn't leave the artistic world totally behind. So I'm going to walk you through a little exercise that I think is a bit of a consciousness shift. Not because I want you to be students of color theory, although that's always interesting as well. Any painters in the room? Okay. So it's not so much about color theory as it is an example of how most of our Western culture has trained us to think in a certain way, and a good example of if we look at experience, real experience, we can actually tap into a shifted view of that. So let me walk you through this. Everyone, if you've been to a science museum, been through 6th grade, optics or color class, you've all had experiences of this, but maybe not put together quite in the same way. So, painters in the room, can you tell me what the 3 primary colors are? Red, yellow, and blue. Thank you. Can you tell me, everybody with me on that? That should sound pretty familiar. Most of this is going to sound familiar until we get a little further down the line. Secondary colors. Green, violet, purple, and orange. And they are secondary colors because of any 2 primary colors. So any 2 primary colors create a secondary color. Great. Everybody with me so far? This is, okay, it's going to get a little more complicated. How many of you have heard the term complementary colors? Yeah? Okay. And complementary colors are, can anybody tell me what they are? Usually, whoops, okay. Usually the answer is, so those are the ones that are across from each other on the color wheel, right? Oftentimes, if we remember the art class that you took, right, they were treated as opposites, remember? Okay, so first shift in consciousness. What does the word complement mean, to be a complementary color? No, that word means complete, right? So a complementary color completes something. And what does it complete? It actually completes the presence of all 3. Because when you have a primary color and a secondary color, all 3 colors are present. Right? So you have red and green, and you have red, yellow, and blue. Okay, everybody with me? Okay. So even in the 2, 3 are present. Okay? Now we're going to stretch. How many of you have ever heard the principle of simultaneous contrast? Uh-oh. Okay. I'm sure you have experienced this. And the principle of simultaneous contrast means that if you put red next to neutral gray, the gray looks green. You've all seen this in your science textbooks, right? It's called simultaneous contrast. If you take that same gray and put next to yellow, it looks violet. The gray looks violet. So in other words, that gray is taking on the characteristic of the complement, right? And what that's really telling you is that how could it be simultaneously present there if you're looking at that color and that changes? What it's really saying is that inwardly, we are experiencing the complement while we're looking at the color. Okay? Okay, last piece. If you look at one color for a really long period of time, everybody's done this. I'm sure everybody's done this, right? What happens when you close your eyes, for example? You see the complement, right? Isn't that interesting? So where was that complement while you were looking at the color and then closed your eyes and it was suddenly there? So we're trained to think we're just looking at red, But if we are trained to understand what we're looking at and the inner experience of what we're looking at, we will see wholeness because we're looking at the red and experiencing the green. Okay? So what that is one example of how we need to change our consciousness, because Western culture has worked really hard to say, oh, experience is really nice, but it doesn't really matter. What really matters is just looking at the red, not the experience of it. And that is critically important because that is the link and the awakening to what we're doing in the world and the inner experience of that. And hopefully when I take it a little bit further, and I'm hoping you're going to be my timekeeper as well, because I don't see a clock in the room. Okay. Okay, so that's your shift in consciousness. If we can change our consciousness to recognize that actually we're always experiencing wholeness, even though we may be looking at one part, then something will change. We'll make decisions in a very different way and from a very different perspective. So that's the shift in consciousness that I hope to talk a little bit about around intuition, money, and service. So intuition, as we heard earlier, is actually a picture of spiritual life. Very broad brush, right? That which is not material, that which you can't put your hands around, it is that which is unique to us. Nobody else can do my spiritual life for me. Right? It's a very beautiful picture. So intuition is mine, and we may share intuitions, we may build a collective intuition, we may build all sorts of it, but without that first experience inwardly, that second part doesn't emerge. And we also know that that spiritual life, that identity, that meanness in me, that essence of myself, has to be free. When that is not free, basically somebody is telling me who I am. How does that feel to anybody? That doesn't usually feel very good. And we sometimes do that to each other. But that inner freedom, that spiritual freedom, absolutely has to be respected. That is kind of I would say, almost a cardinal law, or we lose that essence of ourselves, that verticality that was referred to earlier. So that's also individuality. I am who I am out of that sense of the spirit. And there's a whole lot of different cosmologies around that, but ultimately that's what we're talking about. So there's the individual. And then, somehow or other, I have to be in the world, because it doesn't work very well being all by myself. And we have to move into this world knowing that each person has that individuality, but needs to talk to each other and find ways of being together. That is really about how we create our agreements. Right? And it's the agreements that carry our social life. So now I'm going to push you even more. What's money? It's an agreement, right? So all this money we're working with all the time represents nothing more than an agreement, right? We could and have created all sorts of different kinds of currencies to work for exchange if we know how to create agreements around it. It's just that federal currency is rather convenient, and you can carry it with you if you're traveling around, and you go to banks, and so that is the accepted modality. But we live in all sorts of currencies. I would even say the currency of love, the currency of relationships, reputational currencies. They're all moving all of the time, and what allows them to move, let us say transact, is the nature of our agreements. Right? So no gift is ever given without some agreement, and something moves as a result. It's also true that the principle governing those agreements is a principle of equality. You cannot create a rule or an agreement for somebody else. You can try, and we do this all the time, unilateral agreements, but it never sticks. It's not sustainable. And two individuals, two organizations, two nations sit down together, meet as equals, and come to an agreement that actually recognizes both, right? And not one is more powerful than the other. That is what I would call how we have power with each other rather than over. And that in itself is a paradigm shift of the nature of power. But that's in the agreements. And actually, that's what money represents as a whole. So money is also not a singular thing, and we could probably have hours of discussion just trying to describe what's money. Aside from an agreement, what else is it? It's in the form of energy, and I would also argue that it is a measure, it's a store of value. It allows us to move in our economic life on this framework of agreements around valuation. But it's also not a singular thing, because money allows us to do lots of things. We can purchase things, we can lend money to people, we can gift money, and the inner gesture of each of those kinds of transactions is quite different. And yet, we're all trained to think, well, money, it's all about transactions, right? You go to your bank, you go to your ATM, you get your money, transaction, don't even need to talk to anybody, right? But would you ever lend money to somebody without a conversation or an agreement of some sort? I don't think so. Right? So there's an inherent relationship in the lending function around money that's quite different than, let us say, the purchaser just going to your ATM. Anybody ever gone to the store and done self-checkout? Right? Right? And, 2 in the morning, self-checkout's great because you don't have to talk to anybody, right? Right. But it's just an indicator that we don't need relationships, right, in those kinds of purchase transactions. But you can't do a loan without some kind of relationship, without some sense of mutuality, right? And then there's the whole question of gift money and what moves that. And that is, to my mind, a place where intuition surfaces into the agreement world, because we intuit who can make best use of money that I don't need. That's what a gift is. Right? Who can make best use of the money that I don't need? And that is also an imagination of someone getting their work done out of their destiny path. That's my language around it, but somebody who really has in mind to get something done, but also completing something of my destiny path because I've recognized that in somebody else. Right? That's hugely important moment. So that's where I would say the intuition, if it shows up in relation to gift, because it's what allows the gift to move. But there's still an agreement around it. I'm going to give you this money, and if in the agreement is saying there are no strings attached, that's still an agreement. So that's what allows the transactions to happen. How am I doing? Oh, what time am I supposed to be done?
You can carry on to
Wow. Yep, time is money. Well, so the third piece, which is this question of service, a hugely important concept, but for me it lands in the world of economics. So why economics? It means that we're able, out of our inner capacity, to recognize the needs of others. That's what service is. Why would you serve someone if you don't recognize their needs? We tend to not serve people if they don't need it, but if somebody has a need, that calls on a certain altruistic force from us, which is not really about my individuality, although it's informed by that. It's certainly not necessarily informed by an agreement, because I don't need an agreement to recognize somebody else's need, right? I can just do that as a capacity. It's actually functioning as an awakeness to what I call compassionate interdependence. It's awakening to the fact that actually we really depend on each other. And if we're not paying attention to each other in that, we won't meet each other's needs. We will go to a very antisocial place, which is I will just use money and I will use power to take care of myself, which is in a sense withdrawing from that energetic system. And it's also a myth, because no one would be sitting here. There would be no chairs, no clothes to wear, the airplane that I flew here. We are absolutely 100% dependent on others to get done what we need to get done. So anybody who tells you, oh, you just take care of yourself and I work for myself, it's a big lie. We haven't yet penetrated the myth of that, because if you look at the economic world, the money world, it's still all measured by accumulation instead of by circulation. Because the circulation actually is a picture of that interdependence moving. So that's really the third. So I have three different realms here. I've got intuition, which is this spiritual individuality. I have this whole world of money, which is about agreements. And then I have this whole world of service, which is about being awake to others' needs, right? And hopefully out of that, others will be awake to my needs and they will meet mine. So we're in this kind of circulatory picture. So that's a kind of a threefold picture of how we are in the world. So the challenge is, how do I integrate my agreement self, my free spiritual self, right, and my altruistic, heart-centered awareness of others' needs? Because we tend to treat them as quite separate entities, right? When I'm with my money, this is the whole notion. Well, it's great. We have this beautiful for-profit world, not-for-profit world, and we're going to get great things done in this vision, and then you talk about money. And instead of this abundance, which I often experience in this kind of visionary quality, we get the modality of scarcity, right? When it gets to money, it's the never enough, like so the opposing force. How do we get that integrated, and how do we do the work that actually frees up both the service and the intuition? If we find a different relationship to money. So they are related to each other, and they're parts of a whole. And they mediate each other, because in many ways, freedom, if I can put it that way, is a mediator, right, between recognizing other needs and our agreements. Because every agreement we're free to step into and out of, but you can't change the agreement while you're in it without renegotiating it. So you're always free to renegotiate it, but you're not free to do whatever you want once you've made an agreement. So they are connected in that way. So what I'd like to do, because I'm close to the time, is to say, what from that color exercise, right, in which we know inwardly and outwardly we're experiencing wholeness between the outer world and what we experience inwardly. That is how we create whole. I think the human being wants to see wholeness in the world. Health is another way of looking at that. Is to realize when we're making money decisions, right, rather than being in fear, can we understand, so I'm going to use the word afterimage, but it's not exactly literally an afterimage in the scientific sense of the word, but can we say when we're creating agreements around the use of money, can we also know that actually whatever agreement we make conditions the intuition, that spiritual self, and it also conditions how we are in the economic world, right? So they actually are always in the background because, as I did with the complementary colors and with the experience of the afterimage, three are always co-present in the one, even though you may be only paying attention to one of those. So you may be working with money, but they have implications. They change. In the same way, if you change a primary color, it's going to change, if you change a complement, anytime you change a shade of that is also changing its relationship into the whole. So that's a kind of systemic thinking. And I know it's pushing it, and it's a piece of work, but it's a kind of systemic thinking that know out of my intuition if something is right. What are the consequences for the other realms? What are the economic consequences of something I decide to do out of intuition? And am in that process, can I be awake to those consequences? Because I am changing the whole, because it's whole system. So I promised that I would try to keep it short, which I managed to do. The hope was a little shift in consciousness and an awareness of a kind of wholeness in relation to intuition and money and service, and see that they're not separate places in while the principles change, we're still whole human beings, and we want to bring the best of ourselves to each of those. But know that we're creating agreements. We have to do that, not because I'm more spiritual than you. We create our agreements because we're equals as human beings. Right? And we're in the world of service. It's really reckoning with what are the needs in the world that are truly needed, and how can I meet those in service to those. So in some senses, intuition is in service to money, and money's in service to service, and service is in service to intuition, because they inform each other. They're part of that whole system. So, thank you.